Welcome to the Humanized Books channel. Today, Summary Mini Book is based on the 99 Lessons in Critical Thinking by author Robert Friedland. Dr. Friedland is a clinical and research neurologist devoted to the study of brain disorders associated with aging. He has authored or co-authored over 220 scientific publications in referred journals and has received research funding from the National Institutes of Health, as well as several foundations, institutes, corporations, and families. You don't see the world as it is. You see it as your brain allows you to. Every day, your mind filters reality, fills in gaps, ignores details, and quietly makes assumptions without asking your permission. Most of the time, that works. Sometimes, it leads to serious mistakes. This book was written by a neurologist who spent decades watching smart people get things wrong. Doctors, scientists, experts. Not because they lacked knowledge, but because they didn't notice how their own thinking was working against them. These are not lessons about being smarter. They are lessons about paying attention to your thoughts, to your biases, to the people in front of you. In the next few minutes, you'll hear ideas that can change how you make decisions for the rest of your life. Let's begin. Introduction. Robert Friedland's 99 Lessons in Critical Thinking is not a textbook in the usual sense. It does not attempt to fill the reader with facts, formulas, or protocols. Instead, it aims at something far more difficult and far more valuable, teaching the reader to become aware of their own thinking. Friedland's central concern is not what we know, but how we come to believe that we know it. Friedland writes as a physician, neuroscientist, educator, and lifelong observer of human behavior. He serves as Rudd Chair and Professor in the Departments of Neurology and Anatomy and Neurobiology at the University of Louisville School of Medicine. His professional life spans decades of patient care, scientific research, and teaching. This long experience shapes the book's voice, calm, reflective, occasionally firm, and deeply human. The lessons are not abstract philosophy. They are grounded in lived experience, clinical encounters, historical examples, and moments where attention or its absence changed outcomes. A recurring concern throughout the book is the danger of information overload. Modern medicine and science produce more data than any human mind can comfortably process. Electronic health records, imaging, laboratory tests, algorithms, and now artificial intelligence all promise clarity. Yet they also risk obscuring what matters most. Friedland repeatedly reminds the reader that knowledge alone does not equal understanding. Without attention, judgment, and compassion, information becomes noise. The book's purpose is to help readers observe their own cognition. Friedland urges us to pay attention to how we learn, how we remember, how we focus, and how our expectations shape what we see. Much of human thinking happens on autopilot. We act, judge, and decide without noticing the assumptions guiding us. Critical thinking, in Friedland's view, begins when we slow down enough to notice this process. Although the book is written primarily for doctors and scientists, Friedland makes it clear that its lessons apply far beyond medicine. When he refers to doctors, he includes all healthcare providers and researchers, but he also welcomes curious non-specialists. Anyone who makes decisions, evaluates claims, listens to others, or tries to understand complex situations can benefit from these lessons. The book speaks to teachers, students, leaders, caregivers, and lifelong learners. Another defining feature of the book is its respect for stories. Friedland emphasizes that humans evolved to learn through narrative long before formal education or written language existed. Stories anchor memory, emotion, and meaning in a way that isolated facts cannot. As a result, many lessons unfold through patient stories, historical anecdotes, or moments from Friedland's own career. These are not decorative, they are instructional. Each story demonstrates a principle about attention, bias, observation, or judgment. Friedland also consistently emphasizes humility. He reminds readers that much of what we believe today will eventually be shown to be incomplete or wrong. History is filled with brilliant thinkers who are confident and mistaken. Awareness of this fact should not produce cynicism, but caution. Critical thinking does not mean constant skepticism or attack. It means openness, curiosity, and a willingness to revise beliefs when evidence or experience demands it. Importantly, Friedland rejects the idea that critical thinking is cold or detached. Compassion, he argues, is not separate from reasoning. Understanding another person's experience is essential for good judgment. In medicine, this means seeing the patient as a person, not a diagnosis. In science, it means respecting uncertainty and complexity. In life, it means recognizing that people are shaped by stories, limitations, and unseen struggles. The 99 lessons that follow are not ranked by importance. They can be read in order or independently. Together, they form a guide for becoming more attentive, more thoughtful, and more humane. This mini-book preserves that spirit, reorganizing Friedland's insights into a continuous, listenable narrative while maintaining fidelity to his ideas, examples, and intent. The book is divided in 7 sections with total of 99 lessons. Section 1, Doctor-Patient Interactions. Section 1 sets the foundation for everything that follows in the book. Friedland begins not with techniques or rules, but with perception, attention, and human presence. Before diagnosis, before data, before analysis, there is a person in front of you and a mind inside you. This section explores how easily reality is filtered, distorted, or missed entirely, and why good thinking in medicine and in life begins with awareness of those limits. Lesson 1. The world is too complex to perceive directly. Friedland opens with a humbling truth. Humans do not experience the world as it actually is. Our senses evolved for survival, not accuracy. We perceive only a narrow slice of reality, shaped by biology, evolution, and necessity. The brain does not record everything. It guesses, it fills gaps, it simplifies. This matters deeply in medicine and critical thinking because it reminds us that certainty is often an illusion. What we see is influenced by what we expect to see. Friedland emphasizes that awareness of this limitation is more important than trying to overcome it. You cannot perceive everything, but you can remain aware that you are always overlooking something. He illustrates this with evolutionary examples, daily life scenarios, and reflections on attention. A good observer is not someone who notices everything, but someone who understands that attention always involves exclusion. Critical thinking begins with humility about perception. A person to know. Edward O. Wilson. Wilson's work on evolution and human perception reinforces the idea that the brain is shaped by survival needs, not by truth-seeking alone. His concept of consilience, the unity of knowledge, echoes Friedland's call to integrate biology, history, and observation. Lesson 2. Attention determines what we perceive. Building on the first lesson, Friedland argues that attention is the true gatekeeper of experience. We do not experience what happens to us. We experience what we attend to. Attention gives structure to chaos, turning raw sensory input into meaning. Expectations guide attention. When expectations are poorly set, perception becomes distorted. Friedland gives examples from language, clinical encounters, and visual illusions to show how easily the mind fills in gaps. This is efficient but dangerous when left unexamined. In clinical settings, this lesson warns against premature labeling. If a patient is introduced as the stroke in room 37, the mind narrows prematurely. Friedland reminds us that labels can erase the person and bias judgment before listening even begins. A person to know, William James. James's insights into attention and consciousness form the philosophical backbone of this lesson. His observation that experience depends on selective interest aligns perfectly with Friedland's emphasis on awareness. Lesson 3. Stories came before books. Humans evolved to learn through stories, not lists of facts. Long before writing existed, knowledge was transmitted through narrative. Friedland emphasizes that this evolutionary history still shapes how we learn, remember, and understand. In medicine, every patient is a story. Facts become meaningful when embedded in narrative context. A diagnosis read in a book is weaker than one encountered in a living person. Stories engage multiple senses and emotions, strengthening memory and understanding. Friedland encourages clinicians and thinkers to respect stories, both their own and others. When explaining instructions or treatment, framing them as part of a coherent story improves understanding and compliance. Information without narrative rarely changes behavior. Lesson 4. Be fierce in the pursuit of learning and patient care. This lesson introduces a word Friedland uses deliberately: fierce. Learning does not happen passively. Attention must be active, sometimes aggressive. Sitting quietly, avoiding questions, or relying on others to interpret information leads to shallow understanding. Friedland challenges institutional passivity. Students are often discouraged from questioning. Yet real learning requires curiosity, persistence, and the courage to speak. He urges learners to follow cases beyond their immediate responsibility, to look up answers later, and to maintain personal records of experiences that spark curiosity. Ferocity also applies to patient advocacy. Friedland shares powerful stories where persistence could have saved lives. Caring deeply means refusing to accept easy answers, unclear results, or bureaucratic barriers when patient safety is at stake. A person to know, Sir William Osler. Osler's emphasis on bedside learning and humanistic medicine exemplifies fierce curiosity balanced with compassion. A person to know, Rudolf Virchow. Virchow's work on cellular pathology and social medicine illustrates intellectual courage, even when some of his beliefs later proved incomplete. Lesson 5. Listen to your patient. This lesson may be the emotional core of the section. Friedland argues that listening is the most powerful diagnostic tool available. The patient's story often contains the answer, if the clinician is willing to hear it. Listening is active, not passive. It involves asking good questions and allowing the patient to describe their experience in their own words. Friedland provides multiple clinical examples where listening revealed causes that tests did not. Failure to listen erodes trust and leads to error. The lesson reinforces that history-taking often contributes more to diagnosis than imaging or laboratory tests. Listening is not a courtesy, it is a clinical skill. Lesson 6. Be a good observer. Observation precedes analysis. Friedland reminds readers to observe before interpreting. This includes posture, movement, clothing, eye contact, tone, and emotional presence. He warns against bias and multitasking. Observation requires full attention. Friedland illustrates this with historical examples, including Pasteur's discovery of anaerobic organisms, which began with noticing a detail others ignored. Observation is not about knowing immediately what something means. It is about recording details honestly and allowing meaning to emerge later. Lesson 7. Consider the patient's experience. Medicine is not performed on bodies alone. It is experienced by people. Friedland emphasizes the importance of respect, clarity, and empathy during clinical encounters. Simple gestures matter. Helping a patient with a coat, choosing understandable language, controlling the physical environment, and speaking at an appropriate pace all influence trust and comprehension. He also addresses cognitive and sensory limitations, reminding clinicians to adapt communication to the patient's abilities. Ignoring the patient's experience risks misunderstanding, fear, and harm. Lesson 8. Learn from your patients. Friedland states this lesson plainly. Patients are among our greatest teachers, not because they lecture, but because they reveal how disease, fear, hope, misunderstanding, and resilience actually unfold in real lives. A patient's response to illness often teaches lessons that no textbook can. Learning from patients requires humility. It means letting go of the assumption that expertise only flows in one direction. Patients teach doctors how symptoms feel, how treatments are tolerated, how instructions are misunderstood, and how illness reshapes identity. These lessons are not theoretical, they are lived. Friedland emphasizes that every patient encounter is a chance to refine judgment. Patterns emerge over time, but only if the clinician remains attentive. Ignoring patient feedback because it does not fit expectations is a failure of critical thinking. When patients surprise us, that surprise should trigger curiosity, not dismissal. To learn from patients, one must listen carefully, observe honestly, and reflect afterward. The lesson reinforces a recurring theme. Experience alone does not teach. Attention to experience does. Lesson 9. Intellectualization limits compassion. This lesson is a warning. Intellectualization is a defense mechanism. It allows distance from emotional discomfort by converting lived human experience into abstract concepts. While analysis is necessary, Friedland cautions that excessive intellectualization can erode empathy. When clinicians reduce people to diagnoses, test results, or theoretical models, they risk losing sight of the person. This loss is subtle. It does not come from cruelty, but from habit. Over time, the language of medicine can replace the language of humanity. Friedland does not argue against thinking. He argues for balance. Compassion requires presence, not just accuracy. Understanding suffering intellectually is not the same as recognizing it emotionally. Critical thinking must include awareness of one's own emotional distance. This lesson applies beyond medicine. In any field, when complexity becomes overwhelming, people retreat into abstraction. Friedland reminds us that real understanding requires engagement with lived experience, not just concepts. Lesson 10. Key elements of the patient visit, the interview, and deep listening. The patient interview is not a formality, it is the core diagnostic tool. Friedland emphasizes that deep listening involves silence, patience, and genuine curiosity. Interrupting too early narrows the story before it unfolds. Deep listening requires resisting the urge to steer the conversation prematurely. Patients often reveal crucial information if allowed to speak freely. The structure of questioning matters, but so does timing. Open-ended questions create space for unexpected insights. Friedland highlights that listening also includes noticing how something is said, not just what is said. Hesitation, emotion, and inconsistency often carry meaning. These cues are lost when attention is divided or rushed. This lesson reinforces that good thinking is relational. Understanding emerges through dialogue, not interrogation. Lesson 11. Words influence thought. Language shapes perception. Friedland stresses that the words we use frame how we think, what we notice, and what we overlook. This applies to diagnosis, communication, teaching, and self-talk. Labels simplify reality, but they also constrain it. Calling someone a diabetic instead of a person with diabetes subtly shifts focus from person to condition. Language can depersonalize without intention. The lesson also applies internally. How we describe a problem influences how we approach it. Framing something as unsolvable versus not yet understood changes motivation and attention. Friedland urges readers to become aware of linguistic framing and its hidden power. Critical thinking includes examining the words used to describe reality, not just the facts themselves. Lesson 12. The physical exam. Friedland presents the physical exam not as a checklist, but as an encounter. It is a form of observation, communication, and trust building. The exam is both diagnostic and relational. Performing a physical exam attentively conveys care. Rushing through it or treating it as secondary to imaging diminishes its value. Friedland emphasizes that the exam often reveals clues that tests miss, especially when combined with history and observation. He also notes that physical examination skills require practice and presence. Machines do not replace touch, they complement it. Over-reliance on technology risks losing direct engagement with the patient. Lesson 13. Touch is important. Touch is one of the most powerful forms of communication. Friedland discusses touch not as a technical act, but as a human one. A respectful touch can reassure, calm, and convey attention in ways words cannot. He emphasizes that touch must always be appropriate and intentional. When used thoughtfully, it strengthens trust. When avoided entirely, care can feel distant and impersonal. Touch also grounds the clinician in the present moment. It requires attention, slowing down, and awareness. In this way, touch supports both compassion and observation. Lesson 14. Be prepared for the unexpected. Reality rarely follows plans. Friedland reminds readers that surprise is not failure, it is information. Unexpected findings should trigger curiosity, not defensiveness. Preparation does not mean predicting everything. It means cultivating flexibility, openness, and the ability to revise assumptions quickly. Many errors occur when people cling to initial beliefs despite contradictory evidence. This lesson reinforces a central theme of the book. Critical thinking is dynamic. It requires comfort with uncertainty and willingness to adapt. The unexpected is not an interruption of reasoning. It is part of it. Section 2. Diagnosis and Evaluation. Section 2 moves from human presence into structured reasoning. After learning how perception, attention, and listening shape understanding, Friedland now turns to diagnosis. But he does not treat diagnosis as a purely technical task. Instead, he presents it as a disciplined form of thinking, constantly threatened by overload, bias, and misplaced confidence. These lessons emphasize simplicity, humility, and restraint. Lesson 15. The fundamental three-step approach to diagnosis. Friedland proposes a simple but powerful framework for diagnosis built on 3 steps: gather information, generate possibilities, and evaluate them carefully. This structure appears obvious, yet many errors arise when steps are skipped or rushed. The first step, gathering information, requires patience. It includes history, observation, examination, and context. Friedland stresses that incomplete or rushed data collection contaminates everything that follows. The second step is forming a differential diagnosis, a list of possible explanations rather than a single favored answer. The third step is evaluation, weighing evidence for and against each possibility. A key insight here is that diagnosis is iterative. New information should revise earlier conclusions. Friedland warns against locking onto a diagnosis too early, a common cognitive error that narrows attention and blinds clinicians to alternatives. Good diagnosis remains flexible. Lesson 6. A mnemonic for etiologies, vitamins, ABCD. To avoid narrow thinking, Friedland introduces a mnemonic to expand diagnostic imagination. The vitamins ABCD framework encourages clinicians to systematically consider different categories of causes rather than defaulting to the most familiar. The mnemonic reminds the thinker to consider vascular, infectious, traumatic, autoimmune, metabolic, idiopathic, neoplastic, structural, and degenerative possibilities, among others. The exact letters matter less than the habit, forcing the mind to look beyond the obvious. This lesson reinforces that many diagnostic failures result not from ignorance, but from insufficient breadth of consideration. A structured reminder protects against tunnel vision. Lesson 7. Investigations tests are tools, not answers. Friedland cautions that investigations should serve thinking, not replace it. Ordering tests without a clear question leads to confusion, false positives, and distraction. Every investigation should be justified by asking, "What question am I trying to answer?" and "How will the result change management?" Tests do not eliminate uncertainty. They shift it. Misinterpreting results or overvaluing abnormal findings can mislead reasoning. Friedland emphasizes that no test exists in isolation. Results must be interpreted in the context of the patient's story, examination, and probabilities. Diagnostic thinking remains primary. Lesson 18. Don't be afraid to say you don't know. This lesson addresses intellectual humility. Friedland argues that admitting uncertainty is a strength, not a weakness. False certainty shuts down inquiry and invites error. Saying, "I don't know," keeps thinking open. It invites collaboration, second opinions, and further observation. In contrast, pretending to know when one does not creates blind spots. Friedland reminds readers that medicine and science are inherently uncertain. Honest acknowledgement of limits protects patients and advances understanding. Confidence should come from process, not from pretending omniscience. Lesson 19. Information toxicity. More information is not always better. Friedland introduces the concept of information toxicity to describe the harm caused by excessive, irrelevant, or poorly filtered data. Too much information overwhelms attention, obscures priorities, and increases the risk of error. This is especially relevant in modern medicine, where electronic records and automated alerts flood clinicians with data. Critical thinking requires selection. Knowing what to ignore is as important as knowing what to consider. Friedland encourages active filtering, guided by clinical judgment and relevance. Lesson 20. Treat the patient, not the test. This lesson reinforces a core principle. Abnormal results do not equal disease. Tests must never replace engagement with the person. Friedland warns against reacting reflexively to numbers without context. A laboratory abnormality may be irrelevant, transient, or misleading. Conversely, a normal test does not guarantee health. Treating the patient means integrating test results with history, examination, and lived experience. It also means remembering that outcomes matter more than values on a page. Tests inform care, but people receive it. Lesson 21. It's good to be knowledgeable, but it is necessary to also be attentive to the patient. Knowledge is essential, but it is not sufficient. Friedland draws a clear distinction between knowing facts and attending to the person in front of you. A knowledgeable clinician who fails to notice what the patient is actually experiencing may miss the diagnosis entirely. This lesson reminds us that attention is active. It requires presence, curiosity, and responsiveness. A patient may technically meet criteria for a diagnosis, yet Their lived experience may point in a different direction. Ignoring this disconnect leads to shallow reasoning. Friedland stresses that knowledge should support attention, not replace it. When attention fades, expertise becomes brittle. Critical thinking thrives when knowledge and attentiveness work together. Lesson 22. Consider toxic exposures. Diagnosis must extend beyond the clinic walls. Friedland urges clinicians to consider environmental, occupational, and lifestyle exposures that may influence disease. Toxins are often invisible, delayed in effect, and easily overlooked. Patients may not volunteer this information unless asked directly. Work environments, hobbies, medications, supplements, and even home conditions can play critical roles. Failure to ask these questions narrows the diagnostic field unnecessarily. This lesson highlights a broader principle: context matters. Disease does not occur in isolation. Understanding where and how a person lives is part of understanding what is happening to them. Lesson 23. Family history is an important part of the interview. Family history is not a formality. It is a powerful diagnostic clue that reflects genetics, shared environments, and behavioral patterns. Friedland emphasizes that careful exploration of family history can reveal risks long before symptoms appear. This lesson also reminds readers that family history must be interpreted thoughtfully. Not all inherited patterns are genetic, and not all genetic risks are destiny. Critical thinking involves separating coincidence from meaningful pattern. Gathering family history requires patience and clarity. Patients may not know exact diagnoses, but their stories still matter. Listening carefully often reveals what checklists miss. Lesson 24. Rare presentations of common events are more common than common presentations of rare events. This lesson addresses probability, a recurring theme in critical thinking. Friedland warns against being seduced by rare diagnoses when common explanations are more likely, even if they present unusually. The human mind is drawn to novelty. Rare conditions are interesting, memorable, and intellectually appealing, but probability favors the familiar. Friedland does not discourage considering rare diseases. He encourages proportional thinking. Good diagnosis balances imagination with likelihood. This lesson reinforces the importance of grounding reasoning in frequency, not fascination. Lesson 25. Symptoms and signs have important significance. Friedland clarifies that both the presence and absence of symptoms matter, but not equally in all situations. A symptom's meaning depends on context, timing, and pattern. The absence of a sign does not always rule out disease, and the presence of a symptom does not always confirm it. Critical thinking requires careful interpretation rather than reflexive conclusions. This lesson encourages clinicians to resist binary thinking. Reality is rarely yes or no. Understanding develops through pattern recognition over time, not through isolated findings. Lesson 26. Salutogenesis, the production and maintenance of health. Friedland concludes Section 2 by shifting focus from disease to health. Salutogenesis emphasizes factors that support well-being rather than those that cause illness. This perspective broadens diagnostic thinking. Instead of asking only what is wrong, clinicians should also ask what is keeping the person well. Strengths, resilience, habits, and protective factors matter. Friedland argues that medicine often overemphasizes pathology and underappreciates health. Critical thinking includes recognizing what is working, not just what is failing. This mindset supports prevention, recovery, and long-term care. Section 3. Management. Section 3 shifts the focus from figuring out what is happening to deciding what to do about it. Friedland makes clear that management is not a mechanical extension of diagnosis. It is a human, ethical, and cognitive challenge. Good management requires judgment, communication, humility, and constant awareness of limits. These lessons emphasize responsibility, honesty, and the complexity of real-world care. Lesson 27. Get to know the patient and show interest. The patient is a person. Management begins with relationship. Friedland insists that patients are not problems to be solved, but people to be understood. Knowing who the patient is matters as much as knowing what disease they have. Interests, fears, goals, values, and circumstances influence every decision. A treatment that is technically correct may fail if it does not fit the patient's life. Showing genuine interest builds trust, and trust improves outcomes. This lesson reinforces that care is personal. Management without relationship becomes transactional and fragile. Lesson 28. Learn from clinical experience, but not too much. Experience is valuable, but it can also mislead. Friedland warns that personal experience, while powerful, is limited and biased. What we remember most vividly may not be most representative. Clinicians often overgeneralize from memorable cases. A rare complication seen once may loom larger than common outcomes seen many times. Critical thinking requires balancing experience with evidence. The lesson is not to dismiss experience, but to contextualize it. Experience informs judgment best when paired with reflection and humility. Lesson 29. Use the placebo response to your patient's benefit. Friedland treats the placebo response not as deception, but as a demonstration of the mind's influence on the body. Expectations, trust, and meaning affect outcomes. This lesson does not encourage dishonesty. Instead, it highlights the importance of communication, reassurance, and framing. How a treatment is presented can influence its effectiveness. The clinician's confidence, empathy, and clarity can activate beneficial responses. Ignoring this dimension wastes an opportunity to help. Lesson 30. Tell the truth whenever possible. Honesty is central to ethical care. Friedland acknowledges that truth-telling can be difficult, but argues that withholding or distorting information undermines trust. Truth must be delivered thoughtfully, with attention to timing and understanding. Being truthful does not mean being blunt or careless. It means respecting the patient's right to know and to decide. This lesson reinforces that management is moral as well as technical. Lesson 31. Cognitive function is relevant for all areas of medicine. Thinking, memory, attention, and judgment affect every aspect of care. Friedland emphasizes that cognitive impairment influences compliance, safety, and outcomes, even outside neurology. Management plans must account for the patient's cognitive abilities. Instructions that cannot be remembered or understood are ineffective. This lesson reminds clinicians to assess cognition routinely and adapt care accordingly. Lesson 32. You are primarily responsible for caring for the patient, not the family. Family involvement is important, but Friedland stresses that the clinician's primary obligation is to the patient. Family wishes may conflict with patient interests. This lesson addresses boundary setting and ethical clarity. While families provide support, they should not override patient autonomy. Management decisions must remain patient-centered even when this is uncomfortable. Lesson 33. Denial of illness and disability can be shared by the patient, the family, and the doctor. Denial is human. Friedland reminds readers that clinicians are not immune to it. Doctors may unconsciously avoid recognizing decline, terminal illness, or failure of treatment. Shared denial delays appropriate care and honest conversation. Recognizing denial requires self-awareness and courage. This lesson underscores that critical thinking includes emotional honesty, not just intellectual analysis. Lesson 34. Consider the context of care. Treatment plans exist within social, economic, and logistical realities. Friedland emphasizes that recommendations must be feasible. Access to medication, transportation, support, and financial resources all affect outcomes. Ignoring context turns good plans into bad ones. Effective management requires adapting recommendations to real-life constraints rather than ideal conditions. Lesson 35. Challenges to the ability to provide humane healthcare. Friedland acknowledges systemic pressures, time constraints, administrative burdens, documentation demands, and technology. These forces erode attention and compassion. This lesson does not offer easy solutions. Instead, it calls for awareness and resistance where possible. Maintaining humanity requires deliberate effort. Critical thinking includes recognizing when systems interfere with care. Lesson 36. Do not confuse etiology with pathophysiology. Knowing what causes a disease is different from understanding how it works. Friedland warns that confusing these leads to misguided management. Treatments often target mechanisms, not causes. Failing to distinguish the two can result in inappropriate or ineffective care. This lesson reinforces conceptual clarity as a foundation for good decisions. Lesson 37. Communicate with the patient. Management fails without communication. Friedland emphasizes clarity, repetition, and confirmation of understanding. Patients should know what is happening, why it matters, and what is expected of them. Communication is ongoing, not a single event. Good communication reduces errors, anxiety, and noncompliance. Lesson 38. Be attentive to medications and medication errors. Medications help, but they also harm. Friedland highlights how frequently medication errors occur and how vigilance can prevent them. Management requires careful review of prescriptions, interactions, dosing, and patient understanding. Assumptions are dangerous. This lesson closes the section with a reminder that attention saves lives. Section 4. Critical Thinking. Section 4 is the intellectual core of the book. Here, Friedland steps back from clinical practice and addresses how humans think, imagine, and correct themselves. These lessons apply to medicine, science, and everyday life. They focus on judgment, bias, uncertainty, and the disciplined use of imagination. Lesson 39. Think deeply. Think beyond the obvious. Friedland begins with a call for depth. Superficial answers are tempting because they are fast and reassuring. Deep thinking requires time, discomfort, and effort. Thinking deeply means resisting the first explanation that appears plausible. It involves asking follow-up questions, considering alternatives, and being willing to sit with uncertainty. Friedland emphasizes that many errors occur not because people are incapable of deep thought, but because they stop too soon. Critical thinking demands patience. Lesson 40. How often do rare events occur? Humans are poor intuitive statisticians. Friedland explains that we often overestimate the frequency of rare events because they are memorable, dramatic, or emotionally charged. Media, anecdotes, and personal experience distort perception of probability. This leads to disproportionate fear, unnecessary testing, and misdirected attention. The lesson reinforces probabilistic thinking. Understanding frequency protects against fear-driven reasoning. Lesson 41. Do not depend on logic alone. Logic is powerful, but incomplete. Friedland argues that logic operates on assumptions, and if the assumptions are wrong, the conclusions will be too. Critical thinking requires examining premises, not just reasoning cleanly from them. Logic without context becomes brittle. This lesson encourages flexibility and awareness of hidden assumptions. Lesson 42. Although intuition cannot replace evidence, it can be valuable. Friedland rehabilitates intuition without romanticizing it. Intuition arises from experience and pattern recognition. It can signal that something is wrong before conscious reasoning catches up. However, intuition must be tested, not obeyed blindly. It is a starting point, not an endpoint. Critical thinkers respect intuition, but demand evidence. Lesson 43. Should you think out of the box? Thinking out of the box is often praised, but Friedland urges caution. Creativity without grounding can drift into fantasy. The goal is not to abandon structure, but to understand it well enough to bend it wisely. Constraints sharpen thinking. This lesson reframes creativity as informed deviation, not rebellion for its own sake. Lesson 44. All models are wrong. Models simplify reality. They are useful precisely because they ignore details. Friedland reminds readers that confusing models with reality leads to error. No model captures everything. The danger arises when people forget this and treat abstractions as truth. Critical thinking involves using models lightly and revising them readily. Lesson 45. Biomarkers are not the disease itself. Numbers and indicators are representations, not realities. Friedland warns against equating measurements with meaning. A biomarker may correlate with disease, but it does not fully define it. Treating numbers instead of people leads to mismanagement. This lesson echoes earlier warnings about treating tests rather than patients. Lesson 46. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Friedland emphasizes a common reasoning error, assuming something does not exist because it has not been detected. Limitations of tools, timing, and perspective matter. Many discoveries were delayed because people mistook ignorance for proof. Critical thinking remains open to what is not yet seen. Lesson 47. Being wrong at times is okay. Error is unavoidable. Friedland normalizes being wrong as part of learning and discovery. The real danger is refusing to admit error. Pride, fear, and reputation can lock people into false beliefs. Critical thinkers update beliefs willingly. Lesson 48. Much of what we know is wrong. History shows that certainty ages poorly. Friedland reminds readers that many once accepted truths were later overturned. This is not an argument for nihilism, but for humility. Knowledge progresses through correction. Holding beliefs lightly keeps thinking flexible. Lesson 49. Smart people make mistakes. Intelligence is not immunity. Friedland stresses that smart people are often especially vulnerable to error because they trust their reasoning too much. Confidence can harden assumptions and discourage correction. Highly intelligent individuals may build elegant explanations on flawed premises. When mistakes occur, they may be defended more forcefully rather than questioned. This lesson dismantles the comforting belief that error belongs only to the uninformed. Critical thinking requires vigilance regardless of intelligence. Lesson 50. Fishing expeditions may be productive. While unfocused searching is often criticized, Friedland argues that exploration without a rigid hypothesis can uncover unexpected truths. Some discoveries occur not because we knew what we were looking for, but because we were open to surprise. The danger lies not in exploration itself, but in misinterpreting chance findings. Fishing expeditions must be followed by disciplined evaluation. This lesson balances curiosity with restraint. Lesson 51. Manifestations of bias. Bias is unavoidable. Friedland emphasizes that awareness matters more than denial. Bias shapes perception, memory, interpretation, and judgment. Confirmation bias, anchoring, and framing effects subtly distort reasoning. Recognizing bias requires humility and reflection. Critical thinkers do not eliminate bias, they manage it. Lesson 52. Experimenter bias. Expectations influence outcomes. Friedland explains how researchers and clinicians may unconsciously shape results to match beliefs. This bias affects observation, interpretation, and even data collection. Blinding, replication, and skepticism serve as safeguards. The lesson reinforces the need for structural protections against self-deception. Lesson 53. Bias of the lost actors. We learn from survivors, not from failures that disappear from view. Friedland highlights survivorship bias, where success stories dominate attention while unseen failures distort conclusions. This bias leads to overconfidence and unrealistic expectations. Understanding what is missing is as important as studying what remains. Critical thinking includes asking who or what is absent. Lesson 54. Being smart is not enough. Friedland reiterates that intelligence without judgment, humility, and awareness can mislead. Knowledge must be paired with self-scrutiny. This lesson echoes earlier warnings. Reasoning quality matters more than reasoning speed. Wisdom emerges from balance, not brilliance alone. Lesson 55. Don't be afraid of your imagination. Imagination fuels discovery. Friedland defends creative thinking as essential to science and medicine. However, imagination must remain accountable to evidence. The goal is not fantasy, but possibility. This lesson encourages courage and thinking differently while remaining grounded. Lesson 56. Do not assume your ideas are not novel just because they seem obvious. Ideas that appear obvious may be overlooked precisely because of their simplicity. Friedland urges readers not to dismiss insights prematurely. History is full of discoveries that were delayed because they seemed too simple. Critical thinking requires confidence to pursue clarity. Lesson 57. Consider the evolutionary aspects of disease. Disease exists within evolutionary context. Friedland reminds readers that many traits we consider pathological may once have been adaptive. Understanding disease requires looking beyond immediate mechanisms to long-term biological history. This perspective broadens thinking and deepens understanding. Section 5. Personal and Career Development. Lesson 58. Live in day-tight compartments. Friedland borrows this phrase to describe a disciplined way of managing stress and attention. Living in day-tight compartments means focusing on what belongs to today and resisting the mental habit of carrying yesterday's regrets or tomorrow's anxieties into the present moment. This lesson is not about denial. It is about containment. Worrying endlessly about future outcomes drains energy without improving judgment. Critical thinking requires clarity, and clarity requires mental space. By narrowing attention to the present day, we improve performance, emotional stability, and decision-making. Lesson 59. Learn how to learn and enhance your learning capacity. Learning is a skill, not a passive process. Friedland emphasizes that many people spend years studying without understanding how learning actually works. Effective learning requires attention, repetition, curiosity, and reflection. Multitasking weakens memory. Passive exposure creates illusions of understanding. Deep learning comes from engagement, questioning, and revisiting material over time. This lesson reinforces that how you learn matters as much as what you learn. Improving learning capacity is one of the most valuable lifelong investments. Lesson 60. Find out where you find meaning. Meaning sustains effort. Friedland encourages readers to reflect seriously on what gives their work purpose. Without meaning, even success feels hollow. Meaning is personal. It may come from helping others, solving problems, teaching, discovery, or service. Friedland does not prescribe answers. He urges honest self-inquiry. Careers flourish when aligned with meaning. Without it, burnout becomes likely. Lesson 61. Search for your passion and follow it. Gnaw your own bone. This vivid phrase captures Friedland's advice to pursue what genuinely interests you, not what others expect or reward. Passion sustains persistence when recognition is delayed or absent. Friedland warns that external incentives often mislead. Prestige, income, and approval fade quickly if the work itself feels empty. Following one's passion does not guarantee ease or success, but it increases resilience. People who gnaw their own bones stay engaged longer and learn more deeply. Lesson 62. Learn to critically read the literature. Not all published work deserves equal trust. Friedland stresses that critical reading is essential for intellectual integrity. Readers must evaluate study design, assumptions, statistics, and conclusions. Authority and publication do not guarantee correctness. This lesson reinforces skepticism without cynicism. Respect the literature, but question it carefully. Lesson 63. We are all neurologists. Friedland uses neurology as a metaphor for shared responsibility. Every clinician interacts with cognition, emotion, behavior, and perception. Understanding how the brain works improves communication, compliance, and care across all disciplines. Ignoring cognitive aspects leads to misunderstanding and error. This lesson broadens responsibility rather than narrowing it. Lesson 64. Neurology and cardiology, etc. don't exist. Here, Friedland challenges artificial boundaries between specialties. Diseases do not respect departmental lines. Fragmentation of care can obscure understanding. Thinking holistically improves diagnosis and management. This lesson encourages intellectual trespassing for the sake of patient care and truth. Lesson 65. Do not respect boundaries. Be a trespasser. Friedland extends the previous lesson into a broader principle. Innovation often occurs at boundaries, not within silos. Trespassing intellectually means learning outside one's field, borrowing tools, and asking unfamiliar questions. Progress depends on cross-pollination. This lesson values curiosity over conformity. Lesson 66. Be grateful. Gratitude grounds perspective. Friedland emphasizes appreciation for mentors, colleagues, patients, and opportunities. Gratitude counters entitlement and resentment. It strengthens relationships and resilience. This lesson reminds readers that no career is built alone. Lesson 67. Look beyond the easiest options and pursue the best resources possible. Convenience often limits growth. Friedland encourages seeking the best teachers, environments, and tools, even when difficult. Excellence requires effort. Settling too early restricts development. This lesson closes Part 1 by urging ambition guided by purpose. Lesson 68. Focus, but not too much. Focus is essential, but excessive focus can narrow vision. Friedland warns that intense concentration, when unchecked, may blind us to alternatives, context, and unintended consequences. This lesson echoes earlier discussions about attention and bias. Deep focus should be balanced with periodic stepping back. Critical thinking requires both immersion and distance. The ability to zoom in and out is a hallmark of mature judgment. Lesson 69. Be persistent and tenacious. Progress is rarely smooth. Friedland emphasizes that persistence often matters more than brilliance. Many worthwhile goals require repeated effort, patience, and tolerance for frustration. Tenacity sustains learning when enthusiasm fades. It also protects against discouragement when recognition is delayed. This lesson reinforces the idea that excellence is built gradually, not suddenly. Lesson 70. Do not be intimidated by accomplished persons in medicine and science. Prestige can silence curiosity. Friedland cautions that deference to authority discourages questioning and independent thought. Highly accomplished individuals are still human, subject to bias and error. Respect should not become submission. Critical thinking thrives when ideas are evaluated on merit, not on who presents them. Lesson 71. Accept the help of others. Independence has limits. Friedland reminds readers that collaboration strengthens thinking and care. Accepting help is not weakness. It reflects realism and humility. Mentors, colleagues, and teams expand perspective and resilience. This lesson emphasizes community over isolation. Lesson 72. Pay attention to your own health and learn how to deal with stress. Caregivers often neglect themselves. Friedland warns that unmanaged stress impairs judgment, compassion, and longevity. Attention to sleep, exercise, relationships, and mental health is not optional. It is part of professional responsibility. Critical thinking depends on a functioning mind and body. Lesson 73. Learn from the history of medicine and science. History is a teacher of humility. Friedland encourages studying past errors, debates, and revolutions in thought. Many mistakes recur because lessons were forgotten. History reveals patterns of bias, resistance to change, and eventual correction. Understanding history sharpens skepticism and patience. Lesson 74. Recognize your intellectual ancestors. Ideas come from people. Friedland urges readers to acknowledge those who shaped their thinking. Recognizing intellectual ancestors fosters gratitude and continuity. It reminds us that progress is collective. This lesson reinforces intellectual humility. Lesson 75. You are an educator. Teaching is not optional. Whether formally or informally, professionals influence how others think. Friedland emphasizes responsibility in modeling curiosity, honesty, and compassion. Teaching shapes future standards. Critical thinking multiplies through education. Lesson 76. Learn to be a salesperson. Ideas require communication. Friedland reframes sales as persuasion in service of good ideas. Clinicians and scientists must explain, advocate, and motivate. Poor communication wastes good thinking. This lesson highlights rhetoric as a practical skill. Lesson 77. Learn how to learn from bad example. Not all lessons come from excellence. Friedland notes that observing mistakes can be equally instructive. Bad examples clarify what not to do. They sharpen judgment when examined honestly. Critical thinkers extract value even from failure. Lesson 78. Remember Pierre Curie, Carl Wernicke, and others. Friedland closes the section by honoring figures whose contributions were profound yet often underappreciated. This lesson reminds readers that recognition is uneven and often delayed. Meaningful work does not guarantee fame. Integrity and curiosity matter more than applause. Section 6. Discovery. Section V side is about how new knowledge comes into the world. Friedland demystifies discovery and removes the myth that research belongs only to geniuses, laboratories, or elite institutions. These lessons emphasize curiosity, persistence, judgment, and respect for uncertainty. Discovery, as Friedland presents it, is a human activity shaped as much by character as by intellect. Lesson 79. What is science? Friedland defines science not as a collection of facts, but as a way of asking questions about the world. Science is an organized form of curiosity, disciplined by evidence and openness to correction. Science does not produce certainty. It produces progressively better explanations. Friedland stresses that misunderstanding this leads to disappointment, dogmatism, or misuse of scientific authority. At its core, science is a method for reducing error, not eliminating it. Lesson 80. No single theory ever agrees with all the facts. Reality is too complex for any single explanation to capture completely. Friedland explains that theories are tools, not final answers. When data do not fit a theory, the problem may lie in the theory rather than the data. Clinging too tightly to explanatory frameworks delays progress. This lesson reinforces flexibility. Progress depends on revision, not defense. Lesson 81. There is only one kind of science, and that is the study of everything with all possible methods. Friedland rejects artificial divisions between disciplines. Biology, physics, psychology, and sociology are not separate silos, but overlapping ways of understanding reality. Good questions often require multiple approaches. Restricting methods limits insight. This lesson encourages intellectual openness and methodological pluralism. Lesson 82. It's good to be first, but it is not necessary. Recognition often favors those who arrive first, but Friedland reminds readers that meaningful contributions do not require being first. Replication, refinement, and application matter deeply. Science advances through accumulation, not just breakthroughs. This lesson counters the pressure for novelty at the expense of quality. Lesson 83. You don't need to be brilliant to be a researcher. Friedland dismantles the myth of the lone genius. Research success depends more on persistence, curiosity, and care than on exceptional intelligence. Many discoveries result from sustained attention rather than flashes of insight. Ordinary minds, applied consistently, achieve extraordinary results. This lesson is liberating. It lowers barriers to participation. Lesson 84. Appreciate a diversity of approaches. Different thinkers see different aspects of problems. Friedland argues that diversity of perspective strengthens discovery. Homogeneity narrows imagination. Disagreement, when respectful, refines ideas. This lesson highlights collaboration as an engine of insight. Lesson 85. Why think when you can experiment? Thinking is essential, but speculation must be tested. Friedland emphasizes experimentation as a corrective to imagination. Experiments reveal surprises that reasoning alone cannot anticipate. They ground ideas in reality. This lesson balances creativity with discipline. Lesson 86. Judge every project by asking, what difference will it make to know the answer? Not all questions deserve equal effort. Friedland urges researchers to evaluate significance before investing time and resources. Meaningful research addresses real gaps and consequences. Elegant but irrelevant questions waste energy. This lesson introduces ethical responsibility into discovery. Lesson 87. What is important in research? Friedland emphasizes clarity, honesty, and relevance. Research should be designed carefully, reported transparently, and interpreted cautiously. The goal is understanding, not prestige. Cutting corners undermines trust and progress. This lesson reinforces integrity as foundational. Lesson 88. Do not be obsessed with technology and methods. Tools are means, not ends. Friedland warns that fascination with technique can overshadow questions that matter. New technologies are powerful, but they do not replace judgment. Methods should serve inquiry, not define it. This lesson tempers technological enthusiasm with purpose. Lesson 89. Pay attention to study design, data analysis, and statistics. Errors often arise not from dishonesty, but from poor design and misunderstanding of statistics. Friedland urges researchers to engage deeply with methodology. Outsourcing thinking leads to fragile conclusions. Critical thinking extends into every stage of research. Lesson 90. Be aware of statistics and data torturing. Numbers can be manipulated, intentionally or not. Friedland cautions against forcing data to support desired conclusions. Statistical significance does not equal truth. Transparency and skepticism are essential. This lesson reinforces intellectual honesty. Lesson 91. Pay attention to assumptions of diagnostic testing and research evaluations. Every test rests on assumptions. Friedland emphasizes examining these assumptions explicitly. Ignoring them leads to misinterpretation and overconfidence. Understanding limits strengthens conclusions. Critical thinking includes questioning the foundations of tools. Lesson 92. It is possible to be productive from a distance. Friedland challenges the belief that meaningful contribution requires physical proximity to elite centers. Ideas, collaboration, and insight travel. Commitment matters more than location. This lesson expands opportunity and inclusivity. Lesson 93. You can make contributions as a clinician without a laboratory. Discovery is not confined to bench science. Clinicians observe patterns, anomalies, and stories that generate insight. Friedland values bedside discovery as deeply as laboratory work. Curiosity transforms practice into contribution. This lesson closes the section by honoring observation as discovery. Section 7. Ethics. The final section of the book addresses ethics, but not as a list of rules or professional codes. Friedland treats ethics as lived behavior, revealed in ordinary decisions, silences, and compromises. These lessons are about responsibility, courage, compassion, and how we treat others when no policy is watching. Ethics, in Friedland's view, is inseparable from critical thinking. Lesson 94. Never whisper in the presence of wrong. Friedland begins with a stark principle: wrongdoing gains power through silence. Whispering in the presence of wrong suggests fear, convenience, or complicity. This lesson is not about grand heroics. It applies to everyday situations where something feels off but speaking up is uncomfortable. Ethical failure often begins with small acts of avoidance rather than dramatic decisions. Critical thinking demands moral clarity. When something is wrong, it should be addressed openly, not quietly tolerated. Lesson 95. You are responsible for your actions. You cannot let others take responsibility for you. Delegation does not remove accountability. Friedland emphasizes that following orders or hiding behind hierarchy does not absolve ethical responsibility. This lesson challenges passive obedience. Each individual remains responsible for their choices, regardless of institutional pressure or authority. Ethical maturity means owning decisions, especially difficult ones. Lesson 96. The need to believe in the guilty victim. Humans often seek moral simplicity. Friedland explains the psychological tendency to blame victims in order to preserve belief in a just world. This bias distorts judgment. Assuming guilt protects comfort at the expense of truth and compassion. Critical thinking requires resisting this impulse and examining evidence without moral shortcuts. Lesson 97. Compassion is part of our fundamental nature. Compassion is not weakness. Friedland argues it is deeply rooted in human biology and social survival. Suppressing compassion undermines ethical judgment. Empathy informs understanding and guides humane action. This lesson reinforces that ethical thinking requires emotional engagement, not detachment. Lesson 98. The myth of progress. Progress is not inevitable. Friedland cautions against assuming that time alone improves morality, science, or society. History shows cycles of advancement and regression. Ethical vigilance must be continuous. Critical thinking includes skepticism toward narratives of automatic improvement. Lesson 99. Don't be ageist. Friedland concludes with a warning against dismissing people based on age. Ageism impoverishes thinking and devalues experience. Older individuals hold memory, perspective, and insight that enrich understanding. Ignoring them narrows wisdom. Ethical thinking respects dignity across the lifespan. Conclusion: 99 Lessons in Critical Thinking is ultimately a book about attention. Robert P. Friedland teaches that good thinking begins not with intelligence or expertise, but with awareness of how the mind works and how easily it misleads itself. Across medicine, science, and everyday life, he shows that judgment improves when we slow down, listen carefully, question assumptions, and remain open to correction. The lessons emphasize humility without passivity, curiosity without arrogance, and compassion without sentimentality. Friedland reminds us that knowledge changes, certainty fades, and error is unavoidable. What endures is the practice of thoughtful observation and ethical responsibility. This mini-book distills those lessons into a guide for lifelong thinking. It invites readers not to memorize conclusions, but to cultivate habits of mind that remain valuable in any field, at any stage of life. Thank you for listening. If this audiobook challenged how you think, support the work by subscribing, liking, and sharing your thoughts below. Comments shape future content. Stay curious, stay aware, and return for deeper explorations. All the best, and take care of yourselves.